Junctures from Liverpool, England.
People all over the world are just beginning to talk about the Beatles.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were four very talented guys.
1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name's Paul McCartney.
This is Ringo Starr.
This is John Lennon.
I'm George Harrison.
Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Today we're talking with Debbie Gendler, who is the author of a new book, I Saw Them Standing There, which is about her first-hand experience as a fan who was in the audience for the Beatles' historic performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964. Debbie met with the band's manager Brian Epstein regarding the establishment of a U.S. fan club and also met the band in person and was the envy of all of her peers. So today, let's talk with Debbie and see what it was like to be a fan way back in 1964. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey Debbie, thank you so much for coming on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm so happy to get to talk with you today about your new book, I Saw Them Standing There, and about your experiences being the fan who pretty much started it all. Can you take us back to your childhood and tell us where this all began? How did you discover the Beatles?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. I truly appreciate this wonderful opportunity to talk about the book, because that was the whole purpose in writing it, was to be able to share my adventures with others and hear about their Beatles adventures as well. The whole thing began when I was 13 years old, when family friends visited the UK and didn't know what to bring me back. Their daughter was my sort of so-called babysitter, and she watched American Bandstand every day. So her parents thought, oh, that I, at age 13, obviously was a fan of rock and roll or music, and they popped into a record store and asked the clerk there, what would you suggest they bring back to America? And he goes, oh, no question, bring back this album. He said it was from a band up north called the Beatles. So they said, okay, fine, wrap it up. And when they got home, they presented the album to me, and it was in this sort of shiny brown wrap with a cord. And I opened it up and I saw this group called the Beatles. I didn't know them. They hadn't been on American Bandstand that I had seen. So, excuse me. But I took one look at their faces and I immediately fell in love. I thought these were the cutest four guys I had ever seen. And that was before I even heard a note of their music, and just sort of like thought, wow, their long hair, which is short in today's comparison, but looked long. And I went into my room and played their music, and I thought it was the best thing. And the next day, I invited two friends over to my house to listen to my new album, and they didn't like them at all. As a matter of fact, they didn't even think they were cute. And they left my house and they went and they bought a pizza. I remember them saying, we're leaving, we're going to get a pizza. And I said, okay. And that was that.
And what was that like for you?
Well, this was the very end of April, beginning of May 1963. And I was upset with these two friends. And I tried desperately to find some other friends in my small town in New Jersey to love the Beatles as much as I did, but I couldn't find anyone. I really asked people and showed the album and no one seemed to gravitate towards them really. So I decided, well, I need to find friends. And my parents' friends left the receipt in the wrap of the album because they thought it was, cute where it had like the pound sterling and it wasn't even digital then. It was still like, like 2 pounds, like this, 25 pence, whatever, a quid, and it was a mess, their money system. And attached to that was if you like the Beatles on the flip side of the receipt was join their fan club. So I decided to write a letter to the fan club. And so this was May, never heard anything back. May, June, July. I went away to sleepaway camp in Maine. I hid the album in my trunk that came with me with all my clothes for the 2 months being away. And I would check on it from time to time, make sure it was still there, and there they were, as cute as ever and as wonderful as ever. And I distinctly remember we went on an overnight trip to North Conway, New Hampshire, to a ski resort, and even though it was the summer, it was still beautiful. And everyone went in the gift shop and bought beautiful postcards of the slopes to send home to their family, but not me. I my postcard, I remembered the address, Beatle Fan Club, 13 Monmouth Street, London, England. And so I had the address, and what I wrote was, "Remember me, Debbie Gendler, Oakland, New Jersey." And still didn't seem to work until I came home from school very close to Halloween. So it was the very end of October, and my mother was standing waiting for me. She had a very yellow colored Western Union telegram in her hand from a lawyer's office in New York City asking me to get in touch with them about the Beatles' management arrival because they were looking for teens to welcome the Beatles to America. And would I come to a meeting to see if I could organize fans? So my mom called and spoke with someone at the law office. I frankly do not know who she spoke with at the law office, but anyway, arranged for a meeting on of all days, Veterans Day. I think it was like November 11th, and I had off from school. So my dad drove me to the lawyer's office. And when I got there, I didn't know who Brian Epstein was at the time. I mean, I didn't know what he looked like. I was just going to this lawyer's office to see people. And Brian was there talking to three other men, all with British accents. And I was introduced to him. And that's how I first met Brian.
Wow. And what was that first meeting like for you? I mean, you were so young at this time, and you were pretty much talking to like an almost a professional music businessman. What was that whole experience like for you?
I love the way you turned it almost a professional businessman because that's sort of what it was like. He was almost, he was there. He was being he was very nice. He was very soft-spoken, but yet very much in charge. The lawyer's office who I met, his name was Walter Hoffer, the lawyer. About right after the Beatles' performance on Sullivan, the lawyer Walter Hoffer, and the Walter Hoffer's wife formed a company called Beatles USA Limited that was then run out of Walter Hoffer's law office. And when I went there, it was on 55th Street. But shortly thereafter, after the Beatles came to America, Walter Hoffer moved his office to 221 West 57th Street, where the fan club was run out of for many years until Brian and Nat Weiss started to form a different corporation, and Walter Hoffer was said goodbye to, and his wife Sandra, and it became sort of Nemperor, and they moved to Broadway, where the fan club ended up moving along. But for the first few years, the club was run out of Walter Hoffer's law office. Brian was very much, yeah, as I said, in control, in charge. I remember him so distinctly, mainly because of his glistening gold cufflinks in his shirt. They were absolutely magnificent cufflinks, like that I had never seen before. And one of the men I later found out was a childhood friend of Brian's who was living in New York. His name Jeffrey Ellis, who ended up living in New York and ultimately moved back to London and worked for Brian as like a personal, I don't know, business consultant, person, whatever, for several years, certainly till Brian's death. And the other fellow, although everyone has told me it must be Billy J. Kramer because he came with Billy J. Kramer, I know what he looks like, and I don't remember it being Billy J. Kramer. So I think it was someone else. But our conversation was lasted between 15 and 20 minutes. They offered my dad coffee, offered me something to drink as well. I have no recollection what it was. And they told me a little bit what they were looking for people to do. But I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Epstein. I'm only 13 years old and I have to go to college. I can't work at a job. I have to go to school. And, it was quickly over. He shook my hand and was so genteel and so lovely and said it was a pleasure to meet me. And as my dad and I were walking out of the office, the secretary to not to Nat, to Walter Hoffer called me over to her desk and said, Mr. Hoffer wanted to be sure they had my address and phone number, everything correct. Said, because I think we will need you eventually and your help. And if the deal is signed this evening or agreed upon this evening between Mr. Epstein and Ed Sullivan, and the deal is confirmed, we will send you a ticket to go to the Ed Sullivan Show to see the Beatles at their first performance. And that is exactly how I got my ticket, was sent to me from Walter Hoffer's law office to be in the audience.
Wow, that must have been incredible. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like. And what was it like for you to actually go to that show, the show that's constantly referred to as the one that changed the course of music forever? What was it like to be there?
It really, I was not confident when I left that they would really send me the ticket. But I learned later on that you could write in for tickets to the Ed Sullivan Show. So, not really trusting that I would be sent a ticket, I started to write in. But of course, the Kennedy assassination happened just a few weeks later, like not even, and like a week and a half. And America was thrust into an absolutely terrible, terrible time. And everything that I personally was looking forward to seemed to, like, I don't know, you just didn't talk about such superfluous things when the president had been shot. And even more so that a couple days later, everyone was glued to their TV set and saw a live murder on TV when Jack Ruby leaned forward and put a gun to Lee Harvey Oswald's abdomen. It was like I mean, to see a live murder on TV and you're only like 13 years old, it's just horrible, horrible. So, you know, as things began to unfold in December, and suddenly, it was announced the Beatles were coming to America, that they'd be on Ed Sullivan. I frantically, like a lot of other people who started to hear on frequent rotation on our little AM transistor radios. I mean, there wasn't even FM radio then. It was just I had a little red Sony transistor radio about the size of a present day credit card. And I listened whenever, I could and started to follow the Beatles, but I wrote in madly. There were 50,000 ticket requests for the Ed Sullivan Show for February 9th. And even though I was promised one, I kept writing and I did get my ticket, but it wasn't from my ticket requests. It was from the lawyer's office. And that's how I got the ticket, was from Walter Hoffer at his law office. All my requests for tickets, like all the 50,000 other people who started to write in, I didn't get it that way.
Wow. So it really seems like they went out of their way to take care of their fans.
I really think it was Brian who took care of the fans. I had several meetings with him. Some he was at the law office when I happened to stop by because they knew me. I did things in the New York area. I did print interviews. I did a regular appearance on a TV show that was on WPIX Channel 11 called The Clay Cole Show. I first went on to the Clay Cole Show to promote a novelty record, and I write in great detail about it in the book, and I have the letter from the fan club asking me to represent the Beatles on the Clay Cole Show. I put that in there. I did a lot of things on behalf of the club. I also have in the book a copy, not of the first telegram. I unfortunately don't know where that is, but I do have a later one in the summer of 64 from United Artists asking me to get in touch with them to help plan a fan thing, which I did in sleeping out on Broadway, literally in front of the Astor Theater overnight to organize fans. I was already, a big 14 years old, but we would be guarded by the New York City police. And me and about 11 other friends slept overnight on the sidewalk waiting for the sale of the pre-sale of tickets for the premiere of A Hard Day's Night as a publicity stunt for this guy, Mike Hutner from United Artists, who sent me the telegram. So I started to do a lot of things like that for the fan club, and also organized fans for the United Cerebral Palsy fundraising charity performance they did in September of 64. I helped get some fans there, along with a very long story if you've gotten that far in my book. I talk about it. That was a devastating incident to me because my fan club chapter worked really hard to raise money, and we were promised presenting the money raised at a charity dance, which we put on in my town in New Jersey. And the DJ Scott Muni was our MC and host for the evening. And so we raised a considerable amount of money, and we were promised to present it on stage to the Beatles. And after we raised the money and did everything, we were suddenly told, no, we won't let you do that by the same people who were putting on the charitable event. So, there was a lot of disappointment in being a Beatle fan. It was not a life of all screams and hysteria. And that's why I wanted to write the book, to debunk the fact that being a Beatle fan was not just on the part of a teen girl screaming and madness and running after them, but there were a lot of people who put a lot of work, effort, and meaning into being a Beatles fan.
And Debbie, can you tell us what it was like to see them live at the Ed Sullivan Show?
Um, well, in just a couple of words, it was an amazing experience that I still remember very, very clearly, at least the parts that I do remember. And I can easily recollect how I had to fight my way into the theater because there were so many police officers and people around. And then I got led up to the mezzanine and I took my seat, and I was like all about being more adult-like. I thought, oh, yeah, I'm not going to scream. I'm not going to this. Well, by the time I sat down, the two girls sitting behind me were already screaming and up and moving up and down in their seats. And they were so excited, and everyone else around me. And then magically, I heard Ed Sullivan say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." And they came on the set. And it was like, oh, wow, wow. Like, I, I have to tell you, it took my breath away. Okay. It truly did. And like everyone else there, I started to scream because you know what? It was an infectious screaming kind of thing where how else could we sort of show our love, our appreciation, our admiration for them? It wasn't like we could have a conversation. Everyone says, oh, the screaming teenage fans, the girls were screaming. But how else when you're 13 like I was, or 14, or even the older kids in the audience, 15 or 16. I mean, how else can you show appreciation but by by screaming? And if we were to sit there and just keep quiet. So it was an amazing, amazing experience where we were all together in this experience. And I do remember hearing them. It wasn't like that the screaming was like in any of the, open concert venues in arenas or stadiums or things like that, which happened after. We could still hear somewhat in the audience because the studio was small. I mean, there were, just a little over 700 seats. So it was very small and intimate. So we could hear what was being sung even over all the screaming. Things never quite were the same. Up until I went to the Ed Sullivan Show, and people in my small town in New Jersey, they all thought I was sort of weird, that there was something strange about me. And it wasn't that at all. It was just that I loved the Beatles, and parents sort of looked at them when everyone by like mid-December started to listen to the DJs on the radio and know that the Beatles were coming, and heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, and looked forward to the Meet the Beatles album being released in the States. I think people really began to, understand me a little more and what I had been talking about since late April, May 1963, and just desperately trying to make friends who would appreciate the Beatles. After that Sunday night, the next day, I walked into my school. I was in seventh grade, and the vice principal was standing there. And I thought, wow, I must be in some sort of trouble, because the vice principal was the school disciplinarian. You weren't sent to the principal's office, you were sent to the vice principal's office. And the guy came up to me and he said, I heard that you had this early Beatles album. Can you bring it to school the next day? It was like, geez, even this vice principal was interested in hearing the Please Please Me album. And yeah, it was like suddenly where I went from this kid who everyone thought was somewhat strange and a little weird to everyone suddenly wanting to be my friend. My basement in my house became like, a Beatles Central, like after school, whereas I desperately asked people to come and listen to the album months before. Now we're looking at like 10 months later, and everyone wants to come and hang out at my house after school and listen to the Beatles and talk about the Beatles and listen to either, Murray the K on the radio or WA Beatles C or the WMCA Good Guys. And everyone in that, area, we all depended upon our information from the DJs. And that's where, we got all the gossip and the inside info on them.
Now, one of the many things that separates you from other Beatles fans is that you've actually met all of the Beatles.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that was like for you? Did you think they would be any different than they were?
Yeah. Well, the circumstances upon which I met the Beatles were because I had met Brian and knew the people who were running the fan club. I was sent out to do a lot of promotion for the Beatles in the earliest of days in the US. And I would do like local New York television shows and things like that. And I would go and hang out in the law office of Walter Hoffer, who was part of Beatles USA Limited, and from where his office on West 57th Street in New York, the fan club was run out of in the early years. And I heard that the promoter was going to be selecting the concert promoter was going to be selecting a person to welcome the Beatles to America. So I went to the woman, her name was Bernice Young. I went to the woman who was running the fan club and I said, Bernice, please let it be me. And she said, well, Sid Bernstein will be selecting the person because he was the promoter for the Shea Stadium concert. And this was like in July of 65. So Sid knew who I was, and I hoped that I would be selected. And fortunately, I was. And on August 13th in 1965, the Beatles flew for this all-important, stadium tour of America. And I was there to welcome the Beatles to America at their first press conference. And after the press conference, I was told to remain in my seat because they came from JFK Airport, came to the Warwick Hotel, were there like 20 minutes and brought to this room in the Warwick for the press conference. In my book, I actually have a couple pictures I took at the press conference of the Beatles, and there's one of me standing in the room at the press conference in there. So something fun to look at. But I was told to remain in my seat, and I would then be brought up to the 33rd floor where the Beatles hotel suite was. And I was sitting there, and I was all alone in the room. No one else was there except on the front of the table where the Beatles were sitting was Ringo's empty cigarette pack that he had twisted, a ashtray with ashes and cigarette butts, George's napkin that he used to wipe his mouth, and a glass of water with about an inch to an inch and a half of water still in it that Paul McCartney drank out of. And I looked at all of it and I thought to myself, okay, it's either now or never. Will I regret for my entire life that I did not take any of the items? So I looked around, it was quiet. And I first took Ringo's cigarette pack and put it in my bag. It was a shoulder bag. Still remember it was a taupe-colored leather bag. And I threw that in. And then the cigarette ashes and ashtray in, the napkin. And then I suddenly heard like the door sort of opening, and I looked at the glass and I said, I cannot leave that behind. So I took the glass, even with the water, and I quickly just threw it right in my bag. And the woman who came, young person, but older than me, she must have been in her like late 20s. She goes, oh, they're ready for you. Come on upstairs. So she took me back to the freight elevator, the same elevator that the Beatles used to enter, and up to the 33rd floor. And I walked out and there was this huge commotion going on. The commotion was because there was a girl outside of the window, and they were very large windows. I'd say maybe, I don't know, like 4 feet by 8 feet, very big windows. And there was a girl crying outside of the window, and they were opening it up and pulling her in. She had climbed up 33 floors on the fire escape, and they were leading her away. At that moment, George Harrison peeked around and could see her, but she could not see him. Meanwhile, I'm standing sort of outside of this area, and I could see both at the same time. And George, I could hear, say to one of the police officers or hotel security, let the gal stay. But they said no to him because she would go back downstairs and tell everyone, and they would have all the time that the Beatles were there. Kids going up the fire escape to 33 floors. It was very dangerous. And at that point, they brought me in, and George was still right by the door, and he sort of waved hi because we had like met each other 90 seconds before. I'm not really, but sort of. So he just sort of like, hello. Paul McCartney standing there next. I could tell he was really happy to be in New York. You know, doesn't surprise me that he spends so much time in New York now, and wives were either from New York or New Jersey. He had a sense about him that he seemed very much at home in New York City, okay? And then next was John, standing a little bit further over. And I started to approach him, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at the floor. And when I got over towards him with this assistant who was sort of leading me, he goes, what's that? And I looked down, and out of the seam of my purse was dripping ashen-colored water, dripping onto the carpeting in the hotel suite. And he goes, and what's that? He said, come here, let me see your bag, because you could just see it dripping. So I stood there and I opened my bag for him, held it on either hand, because it was 2 straps. And he looked in and he looked down in the bag and he says, that's rubbish. And I said, no, it's not rubbish. It's for my collection. And he goes, no, it's rubbish, and you're rubbish girl. And I said, I'm sorry, no, it's, I didn't know what to say. And I was so taken aback. And I was just really personally just like devastated over the whole thing. I was like starting to cry when all of a sudden I got saved by a sandwich. In rolled a tray of sky high New York from the Stage Deli sandwiches on rye bread, big turkey with coleslaw and Russian dressing, and roast beef and corned beef with all fixings and pickles and everything. And the Beatles, who went from London, landed a press conference at the airport, came into the city, press conference at the Warwick Hotel. Then right after this, they hadn't eaten. They seemed really hungry. Everyone grabbed sandwiches. I was invited to grab one. Ringo sort of like looked at me with John and just sort of like, I never really met him that day. He just like walked off, like it was just too much to deal with of what was going on with the wet carpet. And I had my sandwich, and the Beatles were all eating, and people were there, like Brian Epstein and the PR guy, Tony Barrow, and Mal Evans was there. I mean, there were a lot of people in the room. And yeah, I think Mal was there, and Neil Aspinall there. And in the corner was even talking to Brian, Andy Warhol in the room, standing there. Was pretty interesting too. And everyone was sort of eating and a lot going on. And then the DJ, Cousin Bruce Morrow from WABC, motioned to the Beatles to go into an adjoining room. I went in. I said goodbye because I felt it was time for me to go, that I could get out of there. And I said goodbye to all of them. And I got let out by Neil down at the freight elevator again that had an elevator operator. And I got let down. And at the end, Neil opened up his blazer jacket. He gave me a copy of John Lennon's Spaniard in the Works and said to me, "This is for your memorabilia collection." And I said, "Thank you." And I left. My mom was waiting for me in the Warwick's lobby. And the cover of my book, the picture was taken the day after I met the Beatles. It was taken August 14th, 1965, at my home in New Jersey. I'm sitting on my bed and I'm reading that book, Spaniard in the Works, that was given to me, handed to me by Neil. That was my meeting with the Beatles. I was terrified. I was devastated. And in my book, there's a picture of the cigarette pack that still had the medallion seal duty free that Ringo had, I guess, gotten the pack of cigarettes on the plane because it had the duty free sticker on the package. And so I have a picture of that just, in the book as just one of the objects, but I do still have all the other objects. Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't want to give too much away from your book, but I was wondering if you could tell me what's your favorite memory associated with the Beatles?
Well, you know, I consider myself a Beatles fan. The whole group is everyone always asks, who's your favorite Beatle? Who's your favorite Beatle? It's like when the Beatles broke up, I can't say that I'm really a follower of their solo careers. I'm really not. I'm not an expert in any way of what each Beatle did individually, the way so many experts are. So I'd have to say that of favorite memories doesn't necessarily involve the Beatles that much, but what I did for the Beatles as part of being active in the fan club. And so, it's so hard to say, but among my most favorite memories is the night I spent sleeping in Times Square with 11 other friends of mine who I managed to talk them into sleeping in sleeping bags protected by New York City police when I received a telegram from United Artists, a publicity guy there by the name of Mike Huttner. And he asked me to organize some friends to sleep on the sidewalk in front of the Astor Theater, where pre-sales were going to begin the following day for tickets to see A Hard Day's Night. And it was a night that I will never forget. It was a hard night, literally and figuratively. I mean, trying to get to sleep on the street on Broadway when the Greyhound buses were coming by and people taking pictures of us. And we were there just trying to do this, but falling into the whole thing of a publicity stunt for the Beatles. It was an amazing experience and something that those friends and I, one of the gals still barely talks to me, She ended up crawling into the theater and sleeping on the yucky floor near the bathroom inside the Astor Theater. They at least left the door open for us. But at 7 o'clock in the morning, someone came through and offered us some hot cocoa and donuts from the Horn and Hardart. No, sorry, not Horn and Hardart, from Chuck Full of Nuts on like one of the corners. And coffee. I mean, at this point, I was 14 years old. We didn't really drink coffee, and just sort of that night was just one of the crazy things I did on behalf of the Beatles. So it's a fond memory now, but it was a difficult one when it was happening.
And did you wind up getting the tickets to the movie?
Well, that's really interesting because I had already seen the movie because I went to 2 preview screenings of it. They had an invitational thing for fan club chapter presidents and other invited important people, like a few weeks before this. So I had already seen the film twice, but my friends hadn't. And we all lived in New Jersey. So we lined up. We were really there as photo ops more than buying it. And my friends got tickets to eventually go see the film in New Jersey, but none of us went again to that venue to see the movie. So I do have the Western Union telegram also in the book that everyone can read and see how I was asked to call this Mike Huttner to get fans to sleep out in Times Square. So it's all in there. You can see it for yourself.
Awesome.
Mhm.
And Debbie, what else is in your book? What else do you talk about? What can the listeners of this podcast expect to read when they grab a copy of your book?
Well, you know, there was a lot. I mean, being a Beatle fan wasn't easy. There was a lot of hardship, and I had to really calculate and devise ways for my fan club members too to participate in things. But my friendships expanded. I started writing letters with George's mom, Louise Harrison, who was known to be quite friendly and compassionate with Beatles fans and did have correspondence with several fans. I've retained about 17 letters, I think, with Louise Harrison. Brian Epstein and his personal secretary, Wendy Hansen, were beyond wonderful kind to me. And in April 1967, I went as a guest to England and of them. And it was Wendy Hansen up until she left in December of 1966 working for Brian, but helped plan my trip. And I went and stayed 2 nights with George's parents in their home in Liverpool. I was able to develop very nice relationships with other Beatles family members. That's really outlined in a great bit of detail where my family and some of their siblings had very close, relationships and ties where we visited each other back and forth in the UK. So there's a lot. And then, just it sort of comes full circle because since 2018, I have been working as a consultant and a producer at Sofa Entertainment, Sofa, founded by Andrew Salt and now his son, Josh Salt. They own the actual Ed Sullivan Show that they bought from the Sullivan family in 1990. And I'm there and consult on many of their projects that they do in association with Universal Music and streaming on Pluto TV and Sirius XM and many other fast channels and outlets of things that the Sullivan Show, and not just the Beatles, but all the thousands of other performers that appeared on the Sullivan Show. So I talk a lot about that, but a lot about the Beatles families and observations that I made over the years, and then being part of Ron Howard's movie, The Touring Years, and I'm on the accompanying material and the DVD, and also being interviewed as part of the 50th anniversary, now 10 years ago, on the CBS Salutes, Ladies and Gentlemen, the Beatles. I was interviewed in the actual body of that 3.5 hour CBS broadcast. So, there's a lot of inside detailed information. That's just a quick overview of just some of the things. But, it's primarily a book that sort of shows my adventures, and that I really hoped it, and the purpose of it was for everyone to share their Beatles adventures. When people find out I'd been to the Sullivan Show or Forest Hills Tennis Stadium or Shea Stadium or Atlantic City or Suffolk Downs, everyone has like a story to tell of where they were, or they've seen Ringo perform or Paul perform more recently, younger fans. And and this is what it is. And I thought, hey, it was time for me to share my story. And I love to hear everyone else's stories too. So that's pretty much what the book is for and what my intent was for the book.
Incredible. And Debbie, where can people find your book? Is it on your website? Is it on Amazon?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. I am not personally selling the book at all. It was published by Backbeat Books. It's available now on Amazon. It's also available in the UK. It just came out in the UK April 6th, and available, or independent bookstores. Is also available through Barnes and Noble, and you can request it at, if people don't want to support, the monolith Amazon or Barnes and Noble, you can go in and ask your favorite independent bookseller to get the book. And I think it's just a matter of, 4 or 5 days till it will appear.
Well, Debbie, thank you so much for coming on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. The links to your book will be in the podcast description. So for anyone listening, they could go click on that link and it'll take them right to the book. And Debbie, just wanted to say thank you again for coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you. And thank you to all your listeners. I appreciate you hearing my story. And the last page in my book, I have an email address, and it's Debbie at isawthemstandingthere.com. If anyone wants to share their personal stories with me, well, I'd love to hear them because, that's what it's all about, right? It's the Beatles were around to celebrate and still to celebrate the good times in our lives.